Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
Suicide is an act of desperation. Antidepressants take weeks to work. An old drug offers new hope for severe depression. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Ketamine has been used for decades as an anesthetic during surgery. It's also a club drug, known as Special K. But in the right hands, it might offer a novel way to alleviate suicidal thoughts in hours rather than weeks.
Antidepressants don't work for everyone, and they can cause unpleasant side effects. Non-drug approaches can be surprisingly effective for dealing with depression.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the latest research on ketamine and clinical insights from Dr. Steve Olardi.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, people who have had a heart attack are supposed to take anti-clotting drugs for at least a year to help prevent a recurrence. But a new study from Denmark shows that during that year, these folks should stay away from popular pain relievers such as diclofenac, ibuprofen, or naproxen. The investigators reviewed the records of more than 60,000 heart attack patients. 1/3 of them filled a prescription for a nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug, or NSAID. Over the course of 3.5 years of follow-up, 29% of these people died. Those who had taken an NSAID were about twice as likely to have a hemorrhage and 40% more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. In an accompanying commentary, doctors are warned to let heart patients know they should stay away from NSAID pain relievers.
A 20-year study of more than 2,000 men in Finland has found that frequent sauna bathing is associated with a lower risk of sudden cardiac death. When these men volunteered for the study in the 1980s, they filled out questionnaires about whether they visited a sauna 2 or 3 times a week, every day, or only once a week. Only 12 men in this study never went to the sauna. Follow-up showed that 10% of those using the sauna weekly died of sudden cardiac death during the study, compared to 5% of those who went every day. The pattern held up for death from other cardiovascular causes, and daily sauna bathers were also less likely to die from any cause during the time frame. Finnish saunas use dry heat, so the results might not hold for steam baths.
Parents are often cautious about feeding their infants peanut butter for fear of triggering peanut protein allergy. Life-threatening allergic reactions have become much more common over the last 2 decades. But a new study published in the New England Journal of Medicine suggests that exposing babies to small amounts of peanut protein during the first year of life may actually reduce the likelihood of peanut allergy. In this British study, more than 500 babies between 4 and 11 months old had egg allergy or severe eczema. They were tested for peanut allergy, and if they did not react, they were randomly assigned to one of 2 groups. Parents of babies in one group were admonished to avoid all peanut products. The other group of parents was told to feed their infants at least 6 grams of peanut protein a week. At age 5, the children were tested again. To everyone's surprise, less than 2% of the kids who had been eating peanuts had developed an allergy. In the peanut-avoiding group, however, more than 13% of the youngsters were allergic. The investigators encouraged parents to have their babies tested for peanut allergy. If the test comes back negative, they suggest that the child could eat peanut-containing food regularly.
Another study published in Pediatrics offers a simple strategy to cut the likelihood that children will develop allergies. Investigators in Sweden looked at the home environment of about 1,000 7- and 8-year-olds. Some of the children had eczema linked to allergy. In the homes where dishes were washed by hand, fewer than 1/4 of the youngsters had eczema, while nearly 2/5 of those in families that used dishwashers suffered with a skin condition. For asthma, the numbers were 2% of kids eating off hand-washed dishes versus 7% of those whose dishes went into the machine. Other factors that appeared to be linked to a lower likelihood of eczema and other allergies included eating locally grown foods bought from nearby farms and eating fermented foods frequently. The scientists suspect that these findings support the hygiene hypothesis that babies' immune systems need to encounter germs during a vulnerable early period, but they admit that more research is needed before parents will be urged to expose their children to pets, farm animals, or other sources of germs.
Doctors have long treated their clinic notes like secret documents, but that attitude is changing. Research shows that patients appreciate being able to check their records and their doctor's notes. A study of open notes in 3 hospital systems included 19,000 patients. The investigators anticipated that only web-savvy young patients would be interested in this electronic access, but they found that even older patients and those with lower education were interested and found the notes helpful. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Watching the Oscars last week made us painfully aware of all the creative people who passed away last year. But perhaps the most poignant loss was Robin Williams, who took his own life.
Suicide is far too common, and we don't have good treatments when someone is in such pain. The usual antidepressant medications take a long time to go to work, in some cases, too long. That's why we're excited about new research on an old drug. Ketamine has been used by anesthesiologists since 1970. Now, new research indicates that it can go to work quickly to help severe depression.
To learn more about the research into this new use for ketamine, we turn to Dr. Elizabeth Ballard. She's a research fellow and clinical psychologist working in experimental therapeutics and pathophysiology at the National Institutes of Mental Health.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Ballard.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Ballard, we are absolutely fascinated with your research involving a very old drug called ketamine. Could you first of all tell us what is ketamine and then what led you to this research?
So ketamine, in terms of what it does, is an NMDA receptor antagonist. How your listeners will probably have heard about ketamine is that it's actually abused as a street drug called Special K. Typically, the way we study it is an intravenous. It's infused into the body and definitely has been used on the street for quite some time. In terms of what's going on with ketamine research now is that there's this exciting new breakthrough around using ketamine as a rapid antidepressant treatment, in that when typical antidepressants can take weeks and weeks to come up with an antidepressant effect, while ketamine can have an effect within minutes to hours.
Now, ketamine has actually been around for decades as a general anesthetic. Can you tell us a little bit about its original use?
So I'm not as familiar with its original use. Like I said, it is sometimes a drug of abuse, but in terms of its traditional use, it is as a pain medication, and it is used sometimes in terms of palliative care patients who are in a lot of pain potentially at the end of life.
Dr. Ballard, I wonder, you mentioned that an infusion of ketamine could actually reverse depression astonishingly quickly. Is it also helpful for people who are feeling extremely suicidal?
Yes, and so that's what's been sort of exciting in terms of my perspective. My background is in assessment and treatment of suicidal patients. So there's been these studies with people with treatment-resistant depression, which means that they've tried many, many different medications that haven't worked. And what was found was these depressive symptoms were reducing, but also the suicidal thoughts were reducing really quickly as well. And there's this great need to get effective treatments for people who have suicidal thoughts. So this was very exciting to look into further.
Well, your point is extremely important, because if someone ends up in an emergency department with suicidal thoughts or maybe even having tried to take their own life, we don't have very much to offer them. First of all, emergency departments are just overwhelmed in general, but in particular for psychiatric patients. And then if they do get admitted, they often get admitted to a locked ward, and we don't have drugs that will go to work for days, weeks, or in some cases, even a month or two.
Right. That is completely true. It's estimated that about 400,000 Americans go to the emergency room every year for suicidal thoughts and behaviors, and we have very little. We have nothing FDA approved to give them. And one of the problems is that we know that sort of the first week after you get onto a psychiatric unit is your highest risk time for suicide over the course of your visit. And unfortunately, our traditional medications don't work during that time. So what we have is people coming into emergency rooms needing help, and the antidepressants that they're being put on are not going to work in time when they need it the most.
Would you tell us a little bit about your research, in particular, what you did and what you found?
So I work at the National Institute of Mental Health, and there's been extensive studies on ketamine. And so when I came on, I was fascinated by this reduction in suicidal thoughts. But what I wanted to know was, is this just a byproduct of ketamine working on depression? Meaning, does ketamine work on depression and then decrease suicidal thoughts? Or does ketamine maybe work on suicidal thoughts independently? And so I was able to take the wealth of data that we've collected over the years and look over at 100 participants in our studies and look at sort of what happens when ideation, when suicidal thoughts are reduced. And what I was able to show was, while there is some relationship between depression reducing and then suicidal thoughts reducing, it appears ketamine has an independent effect on suicidal thoughts, which is great news in terms of thinking about whether in the future we could use ketamine clinically.
Dr. Ballard, that does sound very exciting. We always do like to ask about the disadvantages of drugs or the side effects. Can you tell us anything about what drawbacks ketamine might pose?
Yes, well, and as I've alluded to before, ketamine is potentially a drug of abuse in terms of when people do take it, they may have some dissociation, some side effects sort of during the infusion.
What does that mean?
That means sort of a sense of disconnection from yourself. Like I said before, this is a drug of abuse and it is not FDA approved, and so we don't quite know yet what the long-term side effects might be of ketamine infusion.
Well, when you say it's not FDA approved, what you mean is it is approved by the Food and Drug Administration as an anesthetic pain medicine.
Correct.
It's not approved as an antidepressant.
Correct. And while I have heard of people using it in the community for depression treatment, I don't know if we're there yet in terms of knowing sort of what are all the potential long-term consequences of ketamine use.
Now, when you say used in the community, you mean there are physicians who are now infusing ketamine in certain circumstances.
Yes.
Because they're allowed to do that for an approved drug, but it hasn't been approved for this use.
Yes.
Let me ask you a question that has puzzled me for several years, ever since we began following this very interesting medication for the treatment of depression and suicidal thoughts. It's not very convenient to go in and get an intravenous infusion every, week or two, 3 weeks? Because this drug, while it works very quickly, it doesn't persist indefinitely.
Correct.
So why couldn't it be used orally?
So I think there's sort of two next directions that the field is looking into. In terms of, one is sort of other formulations of ketamine itself. And one of the biggest studies that's ongoing around the country is the use of intranasal ketamine. And so I think that appears to be sort of everybody's very interested in what are the results of this study going to be. So there's the potential to look into other formulations of ketamine. And then there's the other way to think about sort of what are other ketamine-like drugs that might work on the glutamate system, which is what ketamine works on. For example, in our group with Dr. Zarati, they're looking into diazoxide, which might be a ketamine-like drug, which is taken orally, but the trial is still ongoing. So we don't know whether it's going to be able to show effects like ketamine does.
Of course, what I worry about is if a drug company develops a derivative of ketamine, they are likely to charge an arm and a leg. And that means that whether it's an oral medicine or a nasal spray or an infusion, it could be hundreds and hundreds of dollars a treatment, whereas ketamine itself has been around for decades. It's probably quite inexpensive. And as a club drug, as a street drug called Special K, people can probably access it at almost any party in America. Not any party, but obviously it's widely available. And so I wonder, for a parent who has a child who is very, very depressed and possibly even suicidal, waiting for one of these drug companies to come along with a new derivation may not be good enough if they need this drug immediately. What do you recommend for our listeners who are saying, wow, you're tantalizing us, Dr. Ballard. Here's this fast-acting antidepressant that may be especially effective for suicide. We can't afford to wait 5 years.
While I completely understand, and any individual with suicidal thoughts, I understand that's an emergency. You want to get care as soon as possible. I just have to say, in terms of while the results are exciting, what we don't want to do is jump the gun with something that we don't know about the long-term consequences for. I think that I would still recommend that people go to an emergency care facility and see what options are available. There are medications, there are psychotherapies that can be helpful. I understand the tension of wanting to get to this answer right now. It's not good enough to know about 5 years in the future. But really, we need to be very careful about this drug that could really have some serious consequences.
Well, Dr. Ballard, the People's Pharmacy will be looking forward to new research from your team with regard to ketamine, and we thank you very much for sharing your research with us today.
Well, thank you very much.
You've been listening to Dr. Elizabeth Ballard. She's a clinical psychologist and research fellow in experimental therapeutics and pathophysiology at the National Institutes of Mental Health.
We really appreciate Dr. Ballard's cautious approach. We definitely need to know about the benefits and the risks of ketamine use. On the other hand, suicide is a life-threatening situation when people have thoughts of harming themselves.
Absolutely, and we hope that the research proceeds promptly so that doctors will have more tools available.
Now, it's important to recognize that ketamine has been used by anesthesiologists and veterinarians for more than 40 years, so we do have a lot of experience with the drug.
But that also means we do have some experience with its biggest disadvantage, which is this dissociation that Dr. Ballard mentioned. What does she mean, Joe?
When people come out of the anesthesia, they often don't connect their brain and body quite as fast as they should. So there's this sense of dissociation, and it may take an hour or longer for the body and brain to kind of connect up again, which is why the recovery needs to be done very cautiously. Well, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to learn what warning signs might signal that someone is depressed and thinking about suicide.
We'll also find out what loved ones can do if they notice those signs.
What kind of help do people need when they're contemplating suicide?
We'll learn about the symptoms of depression at a lot of different ages: kids, adults, and seniors.
And how effective are the familiar antidepressants like Effexor, Lexapro, or Prozac, both in the short term and over the long run?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 983. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're talking about novel approaches to treating depression. We turn now to Dr. Steve Ilardi. He's Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Kansas and author of The Depression Cure, the 6-step program to beat depression without drugs.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Ilardi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Dr. Ilardi, depression, it is so widespread. And it's so hard to deal with, and especially when it comes to really severe depression where people start to contemplate harming themselves. Does suicide and depression, do they go together?
Sadly, they often do. And in fact, they're so inextricably linked. We find that roughly 50 to 70% of those who are suffering from clinical depression at some point will think about ending their own lives. They're in intense agony. One thing that's often not appreciated about depression is the fact that it lights up the brain's pain circuitry. Just like physical pain, in fact, if we go deep into the brain's cingulate cortex where it represents physical pain, the circuits that represent emotional pain are right next door, and they're interconnected. So when a person is suffering from intense clinical depression, they're in agony. And they're often very negative in their outlook. So they're in pain, they think it'll never end, and death starts to look to many like a welcome means of escape.
Are there warning signs that people should be picking up on that this is becoming a danger?
Absolutely. One of the things that I think one of the myths about suicide is that it's completely irrational, that it's unpredictable, that no one could ever see it coming. And in fact, in most cases, nothing could be further from the truth. Most people who are thinking about ending their own lives will signal their intentions either directly or sometimes indirectly. And those who are around them, who love them, who care for them, really need to be on the lookout. One of the most common things we see is they'll start talking about death. They may start saying things like, I'd be better off dead. They might also mix that with a sense of burden to others. People who are clinically depressed are often acutely sensitive to the thought that their own suffering is affecting others, that they're somehow contagious, and they'll think, you would all be better off without me. When people start using language like that, especially if they've been battling clinical depression, we need to take it seriously. It needs to be on our radar.
What should people do? I mean, I think that friends and family members, when they hear messages like the one that you've just described, get very scared.
Absolutely.
And want to do something, but they don't know what to do. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to take somebody off to the emergency department because that may not necessarily lead to a good outcome. Being locked up in a mental ward for, a week, well, it might save a life, but it also, if it wasn't done correctly, could leave lasting scars. So if you begin to worry that the person you care about is starting to contemplate suicide, what to do?
Well, I think the first thing is to get over our own reticence, to get over our own sense of fear, awkwardness, the mythology that somehow asking somebody about suicide might actually be planting the idea in their head. We're not going to plant the idea in their head. It's already there in many of these cases. So the person who is suicidal, we have to, in a sense, get inside their thought process. What they're fearing is judgment. They're fearing, if I'm honest and open about this, people are going to judge me, they're going to criticize me, they're going to condemn me, they're going to shun me, and I'm already feeling terrible about myself. So what can we do? We can be very direct, non-judgmental, compassionate, And believe it or not, and this may sound a little bit irreverent, but very matter of fact. And as a clinician, part of my training with those who are suicidal or who might be was to be very direct and matter of fact in questioning and saying something like this. Many people who are experiencing the sort of pain that you're experiencing right now will begin to have thoughts about either ending their own life or wishing that their life were over. And because I care about you, I have to ask if that's what's going on with you right now. And when we put it like that in a very validating, non-judgmental sense, many people respond with a sense of relief, with a sense of openness, like, wow, I can actually talk with someone about this who's trying to understand.
Now, Dr. Ilardi, comes the next difficult question, which is, supposing we have such a dialogue with someone we love, and the person responds, yes, that's exactly what I am thinking. You would be better off without me. What do you do next?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at that point, we're not going to talk them out of those negative beliefs. And that's, I think, a common mistake that many of us make with someone who's depressed. We think, oh, well, this is obviously irrational. I'll just present them with a rational countervailing belief, a rational argument for why they don't make any sense. And of course, they'll see my logic and they'll accept it. We can certainly reassure them that, no, in fact, we all want you around. We'd be far worse off if you did something to hurt yourself. In fact, what I want to do right now is to be, in any way I can, someone who can support and help you get the help that you need. So, really one of the biggest things we can do as a friend or loved one with someone who's feeling suicidal is to be a catalyst for them getting help. But sadly and tragically, over half of all individuals who are suicidal are not in treatment and will never get treatment. And so if we can be a conduit, a catalyst for them to get the help they need, then we could actually play a role in saving their life.
And what kind of help should they get? How do we facilitate that? Should they be seeing a psychiatrist, a psychologist? Should they be going to the emergency department? How do we facilitate this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a little bit of a judgment call involved, and I'll try to give a quick principle that we use often as trained clinicians, and that is we want to differentiate between what we think of as passive ideation as opposed to active intent. So passive ideation is extremely common in depression, and that's where the person is thinking, I wish I were dead. But the passive part is, but I would never do anything about it. The active intent is, I wish I were dead, and I'm actively thinking about and planning and maybe even obtaining the means to implement that plan. So if the person is having passive ideation, it's not as acute an emergency. What we need to do at that point is make sure they get in the care of a trained clinician. And by that, I mean typically a trained clinical psychologist, a trained psychiatrist. It could be a licensed clinical social worker, but somebody who has the expert training to really do a careful evaluation and to make sure that they get some form of evidence-based treatment. If they have intense active ideation, then we need to take that so seriously that we don't want them out of our sight at that point. We need to actually make sure that they not be alone prior to being under the care and evaluation of someone who can actually determine the level of immediate threat. And that might mean going to the ER. It might mean taking them to their family physician. It might mean, if they're already in treatment with a psychologist or psychiatrist, calling that clinician for them and arranging for an emergency appointment.
We've been talking about depression in kind of an abstract way, as though it were age neutral. But depression might have different ways of showing itself at different ages, does it?
Absolutely. It used to be thought that depression in childhood was quite rare. It used to be thought of as such an anomaly that most clinicians really didn't even have it on their radar. And what we now know is that it's extremely common, but it's often missed, in part because it's not on people's radar, but in part because when kids get depressed, and even when adolescents get depressed, it often presents very differently. And kids are often very good at hiding their distress. With children, when they externalize, and that's just insider lingo for saying, when they're acting out, when they're acting in ways that are disruptive and annoying and impairing functioning, we take it seriously immediately. We jump in, we intervene. But when they're internalizing, which is to say when things are going on inside that we can't see, like depression, anxiety, very often parents miss it, teachers miss it, peers can miss it. And when kids are depressed, they often won't even know that they're sad. They often won't know that they're upset. They'll often report to us in a way that strikes us as counterintuitive. They'll say, "I don't feel well. I've got a tummy ache. I've got a headache. I don't know what's wrong, but I don't feel good." And that might be the first clue that there's something going on.
Dr. Ilardi, what are the signs and symptoms of depression in younger people, in middle-aged folks, and especially in older people? What were the things that you were trained in and you've learned about to be on the alert for, to say, aha, it may not be typical, but it's depression?
Well, the prototype that we see typically in adults from, let's say, late adolescence through middle age and maybe even a little bit beyond, the prototype would be the person is consciously and vocally sad, upset, they're pulling away from others, so there's intense social withdrawal, there's loss of interest and pleasure in normal activities, their sleep is disrupted, their appetite is disrupted, their movements are slowing down, they complain of fatigue, they're having trouble concentrating, having trouble with their memory, their thinking turns really negative. That's the prototype. That's what we look for. Most commonly. With young people, as I mentioned, we often don't get any report of sadness. We often, instead, with smaller children, we'll get the somaticizing. With teens, we'll often get a kind of agitation. We'll get anger. We'll get surliness, combined often in tandem with social withdrawal, in tandem with decreased performance in all kinds of different areas of their life, in school, socially, and other areas, family life. And unfortunately, with teens, a lot of times parents will look at that and they'll think, well, I'm not happy about this, but maybe that's just a little bit of an amplified version of normal teen mood swings and surliness and so forth. But no, it needs to be on our radar. We need to take it seriously. Now, with older adults, there's a very common stereotype that, well, if you're in your 70s, if you're in your 80s, you're experiencing physical decline, you're having friends and loved ones die off, and so of course you're going to be less perky, less upbeat, maybe more sad. Guess what? The research evidence suggests that the average level of happiness of a 70-year-old is considerably higher than the happiness of a 50-year-old. And so the mythology about, it's inevitable to be sad and down and mopey when we're in our 70s or 80s, it's completely off base. So when we see typical signs and symptoms of depression in somebody in their 70s and 80s, we need to know that is not normal. Now, it could be a consequence of physical illness. It could be a consequence of, I think, as Terry mentioned earlier, some sort of thyroid imbalance. It could be a consequence of any number of physical medical illnesses. But by the same token, the depression that can ensue secondary, let's say, to hypothyroidism, the depression itself is still debilitating, painful, and potentially lethal if it leads to suicide. So we have to take it seriously.
So even though depression and some of these physical illnesses might get confused, jumbled up, misdiagnosed, it's really important to have that workup.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, this is something I feel very passionately about, having worked with hundreds of depressed patients over my career. I think a lot of times we clinicians get a little complacent, a little satisfied with the idea that, well, if we do treatment as usual, if we use a so-called evidence-based form of psychotherapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, or one of the many interventions that are really based on lifestyle that I've been working on with my research group for the last decade, things like exercise and nutrition that we can talk about in a bit, we think, well, if this helps better than nothing, or if it helps better than a placebo, then it's an evidence-based treatment and we're doing the best we can, even if maybe 30, 40, 50% of patients don't get well. My passion is let's get everybody well. And if the first thing that we try doesn't work, let's go to the second and the third and the fourth. And if we've gone through the third and the fourth and the patient is still suffering from this illness, then we need to go into medical detective mode. because there are any number of medical conditions that can drive depression. There are any number of medications that can actually push somebody over into depression, including a very commonly used psychiatric class of medications called benzodiazepines, a class that includes drugs like Xanax and Ativan and Klonopin. Those drugs can actually suppress the most restorative phase of sleep called slow wave sleep, that very deep restorative sleep. And depression can actually be a consequence secondarily. So a lot of times we need to be thinking like detectives with a case of depression that doesn't clear up after a so-called evidence-based treatment.
We'll talk about those anti-anxiety medications, the benzodiazepines, in a minute. But first, the most commonly prescribed medications when someone is feeling depressed are what are called the SSRIs or SNRIs type antidepressants. And I'm curious how well they work. We've all looked at some of the research, some of the meta-analyses, and we've been surprised at how relatively ineffective they are.
It's one of the dirty little secrets in the field, and I really, truly wish it were otherwise. Sometimes when I share with my students, either at the undergraduate or graduate level, the actual research on the relative ineffectiveness of these meds, they think, oh, well, Dr. Ilardi has an agenda. He's anti-medication. And nothing could be further from the truth. But I think we need to face the truth honestly. About half the individuals who are depressed who take these medications will get some benefit in the short term. That means about half will not. If we ask a more difficult question, here's a question that was asked by the largest ever treatment outcome study of meds. It was called the STAR-D trial, and it enrolled over 4,000 depressed individuals at over 40 different treatment centers across the country and allowed up to 4 different types of medication if the patient didn't initially respond. The very central research question that they wanted to address was what percentage of patients can get completely well and stay well for at least a year on the medications. And at the end of the study, even though they didn't emphasize this in their press release, they didn't emphasize it in publication, but when somebody actually went back and looked at the data, they found that it was fewer than 6% of the patients who enrolled in the trial, fewer than 6% on medications were completely recovered and remain that way for at least a year. And so the take-home message for me is we need to do better. We don't need to condemn the medications because, of course, they have helped many people. But in the long term, they don't seem to lead to lasting complete recovery for the majority.
You're listening to Dr. Steve Ilardi, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Kansas. His book is The Depression Cure, the 6-step program to beat depression without drugs.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about non-drug approaches to dealing with depression. You might be surprised that there's a lot of evidence to support such approaches.
Dr. Ilardi has 6 steps for overcoming depression, and they are evidence-based. We'll get him to share them all.
What are the roles of exercise, sleep, and nutrition?
We'll also learn how to use light, social connections, and engaging behavior.
Ruminating can be counterproductive. We'll find out how to avoid it.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 983. That number again, 800-732-2334, or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're exploring unusual approaches to overcoming depression. Our guest is Dr. Steve Ilardi, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Kansas. He's author of The Depression Cure, the 6-step program to beat depression without drugs.
Dr. Ilardi, you have just pointed out that the medications that we use for depression frequently don't work, or if they do work for a time, they may stop working. And I'm just wondering if there are non-drug approaches that can be helpful for people who are depressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is, in fact, it's been one of the most exciting discoveries of my professional career. It never really occurred to me till about a decade ago that there might be some things about the way we're living life that are contributing to this epidemic of depression. I mean, if you think about it, over the last 20 years, there's been a 300% increase in the U.S. in the use of antidepressant medication. And what's happened to the rate of depression? It's simply continued to go up. And so something is wrong with this picture. And so I started asking the question, what is driving the depression epidemic? And really the result of the research that followed from that question is the following insight. We were never designed for 21st century American life. Our bodies and our brains were never designed for the sedentary, indoor, socially isolated, sleep-deprived, fast food-laden, overstressed, 24/7, 365 pace of modern American life. And the consequence is an epidemic of mental illness. What that means then, if we reverse engineer that statement, is most of the things that we're doing in our lives have consequences for the way our brain is functioning, for the way our mind is functioning. A lot of times people hear about depression and they'll hear it referred to as a quote-unquote chemical imbalance. And there's a grain of truth to that, because certainly depression is characterized by a number of different neurophysiological problems. The problem is people hear chemical imbalance and they think, oh, well, then I just have to find the right chemicals to swallow. And they forget the fact that experience changes the brain, that what we do with our bodies profoundly changes the functioning of circuits in the brain that use neurochemicals like serotonin and dopamine, what we feed our bodies, how we move them, even the sunlight that we get or don't get every day can affect the brain. And so that really was the biggest clue to me, that if we change the way we're living, we might in fact have a chance of changing this epidemic in a way that the drugs have not.
Dr. Ilardi, your book is The Depression Cure, the 6-step program to beat depression without drugs. So I'm hoping, of course, that everyone will read your wonderful book. But just to entice them, can you tell us what those 6 steps are, please?
Okay, so in a nutshell, the 6 areas we want to focus on are nutrition, what we feed our bodies and in turn are feeding our brains, physical activity, in particular exercise, social connection, or addressing the pervasive social isolation that people experience, sleep and developing habits of healthy sleep, light exposure, and addressing the chronic deficit of bright light that most of us get by virtue of spending all of our time inside, and then finally, engaging activity that can combat and prevent this horrible habit that so many of us develop when we're alone and isolated. It's the clinical term for it is rumination, or dwelling on our negative thoughts. So those are the 6 areas that we want to focus on.
Let's start with nutrition. What can we do in the way of the food we eat and the supplements we take change the way in which our brain is functioning?
Well, the strongest evidence right now, and the one that we really emphasize in our program, is for giving the brain the fats that it needs. And the brain is about 60% fat by dry weight. And most of those fats our body knows how to make on its own. It can take pretty much whatever fatty acid fuel that we give it and do some fancy chemical magic and make the fats that we need. But there's 2 kinds that we can only get from diet, and they're called essential fats. The key one that we're missing is a class that most people have heard of by now, omega-3 fats. And omega-3s come from things like fish oil. They also come from animals that have been pastured, raised on a free range, but primarily, if we want to supplement, we're talking for most of us about fish oil capsules. It turns out that a dose of omega-3s, there's a particular anti-inflammatory molecule of omega-3 called EPA, and it's been found to be potently, not just anti-inflammatory, but antidepressant at a dose every day of about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams.
Now, so you need about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of EPA for an antidepressant effect. And how long does it take to kick in?
We've had many patients that have reported some benefit, often within about 5 to 7 days. We've had others. I would say that the most common dose response curve, we begin to have reports of improvement within about 2 to 3 weeks. So interestingly enough, about what we will hear and observe with antidepressant medication. And like antidepressant meds, omega-3s also seem to have anti-anxiety effects. They also seem in many of our patients to help with sleep efficiency, with depth of sleep, so a number of potential benefits.
Let's talk about exercise, because we've also heard that exercise not only good for the brain, especially an antidepressant effect, but also good for sleep, that if you are vigorously exercising during the day, chances are you're going to get a better night's sleep.
Absolutely. Just with one little caveat, and that is we don't want to exercise within about 3 hours of bedtime, because then we still have a bit of an adrenaline rush going, and that can interfere with sleep onset. But absolutely, the evidence is very strong that physical activity, especially activity that gets us up in that aerobic range, not only does it profoundly change signaling in the brain's circuits that use serotonin, that help calm us, circuits that use dopamine that help give us a sense of well-being, a sense of pleasure, a sense of energy, a sense of drive and motivation to go after our goals, but it also helps regulate our sleep circuitry. In fact, I've made this comment before, but I think it really bears repeating. If we could take the neurochemical benefits of exercise and capture it in a pill, it would overnight become the best-selling medication of all time. The effects are absolutely profound.
Let's talk about sleep. How much do we need?
The average adult needs between 7 and 8 hours per night, but there's quite a bit of variation. So if you think of the population being like that classic bell curve, there's a small number of adults who do just fine on 5 to 6.5 hours a night, and some who really truly need 8 to 9 to feel well. The problem is that so many Americans are chronically sleep deprived. They're not getting the sleep they need, and they end up masking their chronic sleep debt with stimulants. And over 90% of Americans take some form of stimulant, like caffeine, on a regular basis.
Light. It seems as if the dermatologists have scared us from going outside because the sun is going to damage our skin. How much light do we need? And what do we do when it's cold outside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this question. So one of the big surprises when I first started researching this area is that indoor light, even if we're in an office that we think, or some room in our house, we think, wow, this is really well lit, it turns out to be about 100 times dimmer than just being outside on a sunny day. And physicists actually measure light in units called lux, L-U-X. A sunny day, it's going to be about 100,000 lux. An indoor room is going to be somewhere between 50 and 200, occasionally 300 lux. And there are specialized light receptors, bright light receptors in the back of the eye, an area called the retina. And they've got a broadband connection right to the center of the brain, to the circuits that control our body clock, that control our activity level and our hormone levels. And they need at least 1,500 lux to really get activated. And ideally, it would come within an hour of getting up in the morning, because that's when the brain wants to reset our body clock. We need a lot brighter light than we're getting inside. We need to be spending more time outside, especially, again, within an hour or so of awakening. But great question. If it's cold out, what do we do? Well, thankfully, technology has come to our rescue, because now for less than $100, a person can buy a 10,000 lux light box that has an antidepressant effect, for people who have winter onset depression, people who have seasonal depression. But even now it's been discovered an antidepressant effect for a person who doesn't have seasonal depression. They just have a much more common typical depression that could happen at any time. A 10,000 lux light box for 30 minutes has an antidepressant effect that rivals that of any medication. And even better, the effects typically kick in within 5 to 7 days, not 3 to 4 weeks.
Dr. Ilardi, you mentioned social connection. How can that be used to combat depression?
One of the really interesting things that's been learned from the neuroscience literature on depression is the depressed brain is very similar in some respects to the brain of somebody who's fighting an infectious illness. So if you think about the last time you had the flu, the last time you felt absolutely horrible and just wanted to pull away from everybody and crawl under a rock or into a cave or something somewhere, that's the same signal that the depressed brain is getting. In other words, the person with depression, their brain is telling them, pull away from everyone and just completely shut down. And it turns out to be the most tragic message they could receive. If you're fighting the flu, it's not a bad thing to shut down and pull away. If you're fighting depression, it turns out that isolation, pulling away, actually makes things worse in a whole bunch of ways. But one of the most important ways is when we're alone, we tend to brood and ruminate and dwell on our negative thoughts. And that just revs up the brain's stress response. It revs up the intensity of our emotional circuitry. It makes things much, much worse. So if a person is clinically depressed, one of the things that we've done in our treatment program here at the University of Kansas is help those individuals resist the temptation, resist the urge to pull away, and gradually get them back out into the world of other people and other engaging activities that we're designed for.
When we asked you to list your 6 steps, the last one was some kind of engaging behavior that would prevent that type of brooding or ruminating. Can you explain that briefly, please?
Absolutely. Again, if you think about what happens when we're unengaged, there have been some really interesting studies published recently on mind wandering, on daydreaming. And it turns out that even if a person is not clinically depressed, even if they're not clinically anxious, on average, when they're just kind of sitting there, not engaged, maybe they're stuck in traffic, maybe they're washing the dishes and there's nothing occupying their minds, more often than not, their mood will drift into a negative direction and they'll begin brooding and ruminating. And so what's the antidote? It's to be involved in something more engaging. Now, sometimes, of course, we do get stuck in traffic, but what can we do? Well, we can listen to NPR. We can listen to a podcast. We can listen to some of our favorite music. We can talk to a companion in the car. If we are talking to another person, I just want to raise one quick little red flag to be on the lookout for. Women in particular have been found vulnerable to an activity called co-rumination, where one depressed woman will be talking with a friend, a loved one, and the rumination will become contagious. And now pretty soon both parties are ruminating together out loud. And that turns out not to be helpful at all. And so one of the things we advise both for our patients and for their loved ones and friends is when you spend time with this person, spend it on shared activity. Something that can get you out into the world of activity and other people that you're designed for, and not for that kind of brooding, even if it takes place in a social context with somebody else out loud. Now, I want to be really careful because I'm not saying if you have a friend who's ruminating with you out loud about something that's legitimately upsetting, you certainly want to be, you want to be a good friend. You want to be empathetic. You want to validate for them. Yeah, that's really hard. I can't imagine what that's like for you. Do you want to talk about it? But at a certain point, and I usually, for my own patients, will suggest a cutoff, a rule of thumb of 5 to 10 minutes. And what they find for themselves is kind of interesting. I've had patients do this experiment. Well, they'll say, you know what, when I'm ruminating, I'm getting insights. While I'm thinking about it, I'm helping myself figure out how to better solve my problems. I say, great. When do you hit the point of diminishing returns? When does that process go from constructive and adaptive to basically now it's no longer helpful? And typically they found 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll say, great. Why don't you, next time you find yourself ruminating, actually set a timer on your phone or on your computer? Give yourself 10 minutes. Maybe get out a sheet of paper. Write down every insight that's occurring to you. There's something even about the act of writing things down, putting our thoughts on paper, that helps us walk away from them sometimes. Like when we're trying to remember something and we make a list, and then we can we're not so tormented by it. We don't wake up at 3 a.m. once we've written it down.
So, Dr. Ilardi, in the minute that we have left, I'm getting a sense that instead of like a single drug that is supposed to kind of solve the problem, which we now know from the data it won't, what you're talking about is a program, a number of things, all of which together synergistically make a huge difference for people who are really feeling depressed.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'd mention about that is that, we're always looking for the magic bullet with depression, with any other disorder. We think, if I can just find this one thing. And it turns out with most individuals that have depression, there's never just one thing. And so we need to come at it with everything we have. Now, it may be that for a certain patient, we've had patients that have come back and said, you know what, for me, once I started using the light box and getting regular light exposure, that was the cure. That was the thing I was missing. And once I had that, I was good. We've had other people say it with the omega-3s. We've had other people say it with exercise. But we don't know in advance what the 1 or 5 or 10 things are going to be for any individual. So, we take much more of an integrative approach where we're going to use everything that we know in our lifestyle that can actually help turn around the depressed brain and help it function in a way that's healthy for the long run.
Dr. Steve Ilardi, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Steve Ilardi. He's Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Kansas and author of The Depression Cure, the 6-step program to beat depression without drugs. He joined us from the studio of KANU.
And let us remind you that his 6 steps include exercise, nutrition, and adequate sleep,
light, social connections, and engaging behavior.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redx Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 983. That number again, 800-732-2334, or go to our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can share your own experience and thoughts on today's show. Next week, Dr. Gil Welsh will share with us less medicine, more health.
You can sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You never need to miss another People's Pharmacy program again, and you can share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Please join us again next week to learn about the benefits and harms of screening.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.